This story occurred in 2002, when I was 6 or 7. It takes place in Colorado, near a huge part where mountains are, which was close to the border where the city and the forest meet. I was at my dad's house waiting for my stepdad to pick me up to go to my mom's house. My parents were divorced, and my mom was at work, so she asked my stepdad if he was okay with picking me up. My dad couldn't take me, because he was going to a meeting for work. As I was waiting, I was just listening to music and daydreaming. Eventually, my stepdad, Graham, appeared at the front door. I could see him out of the blinds that were open, and he seemed different than what he usually looked like. His eyes were red, and he looked extremely tired. I didn't think much of it, and just focused on the music I was listening to. My dad opened the door after the bell rang, and gave me a weird look, as if he didn't want Graham to take me to my mom's, although he seemed like he wasn't too worried. I was all ready to go, and my bags were near the front door. My dad said his goodbyes, and I hugged him. We got in the car, and Graham immediately started asking me questions about my week. I told him that nothing much happened, although I was excited about my 2 new dogs my mom had bought for me. He kept asking me questions, and I eventually got really annoyed. They were just really stupid questions, like, "So, any girls at school that you like? How far have you been with a girl? And, have you ever kissed a girl?" I got weirded out and told him that I just wanted to listen to music. After that, he finally left me alone. The drive was long because we were going pretty slow. I began drifting to sleep, but the music that I was listening to kept making me wake up to the point where I wasn't tired. Graham kept staring at me with this weird expression. His face was red and just looked bizarre. I was scared. I've never seen that kind of look on someone's face. He saw that I was startled and creepily giggled. What the heck? I thought, as I shook off the whole event. This car ride was taking forever. After 5 minutes, I told him that I needed to use the restroom. He looked pretty mad and told me that he would stop in a minute. After waiting what felt like forever, and looking out the window for places to go pee, I realized that we were in the middle of nowhere. There was a lot of trees all around us, and I saw a field with a really haunted-looking house. The perimeter of the house was surrounded by huge trees and barbed wire fences. I asked Graham where we were going. He just stayed silent. I got really scared and red flags started flaring up in my head. What the hell? Where is he taking me? Get out and take a piss, he said as he got out of the car and opened my door. I asked him to take me somewhere else because I felt really uncomfortable and extremely scared that he was going to do something to me. No, he kept saying as I begged and begged. After a while, I realized he wasn't going to take me somewhere else, so I did my business. While I was peeing, I felt so uncomfortable and looked back to see if he was looking at me. Well, he was. His hands were in his pants, appearing to be moving in an up and down motion. His face looked as if he finally achieved something that he's been trying to do forever. I felt violated and so scared. What was he doing? Like I said, I was a little kid who was only 6 or 7, and I had no clue what he was doing at the time. That sick fuck was trying to jack off. After I was done, Graham said, "Follow me." Where are we going to go? I thought. I was petrified because we were literally in the middle of nowhere. He tried to get past the barbed wire that was surrounding the huge field to the creepy house, but he couldn't. I was still standing where I peed and didn't want to move. "Get over here," he said in a strong voice. I still didn't move because I didn't know where he was going to take me. "Get over here now." His voice got louder. "Now," he said as loud as he could. His eyes looked as if they were going to pop out of his eye sockets. His face was almost as red as a tomato, and a huge vein was popping out of his neck like it was trying to escape. I could feel my pulse beating in my ears, blocking out all the sound around me except for my breathing. I knew something was wrong. I thought I was going to die. No, I knew I was going to die. He walked up to me, pushing me to the barbed wire fence. "Try to get through," he told me as he went to his car to open the trunk. I was going to try and run away, but there was nowhere I could run. The barbed wire fence was entirely impossible to get through, and there was nowhere to go because of the dead end. The trees were crammed together to the point where it was impossible to get through. I could only run the way that we came in, but Graham could find me easily because he had a car, and it was still daylight out. "What are you doing?" I screamed. Graham just looked at me while shutting the trunk of the car. He walked over to me, and I saw a pair of weird-looking pliers. He walked over to the fence, only focusing on me. He pushed me closer to the fence and started to cut it. He kept cutting the fence for what felt like forever, as I was lost in my feeling of dread that crept out of the pit of my stomach. He finally made a hole in the fence and pushed me through while following behind me. Immediately after he pushes me, I spot the creepy house through the huge barricade of trees. I screamed as loud as I could, trying to get someone's attention. No one. Graham has both of his hands on my shoulders, guiding me through the trees. I tried to run away, but he was extremely strong compared to me. After getting through the trees, he kept moving me, and we finally made it to the trees near the creepy house. "This is cool, right?" he said. I was trying to shut my eyes because the house looked so scary. "Look at it," he screamed. I opened my eyes to see that Graham was smiling and going up to the door. He jiggled the doorknob and couldn't open the door. After that, he put his weight on the door and pushed it as hard as he could, as if he knew how to open the door. The door flew open, and immediately after opening the door, I saw blood stains, and the ground was annihilated with leaves and clothes. This was scary as shit. My knees were wobbling and I was shaking so much. I couldn't keep myself together. Then I heard someone scream. It was the most dreadful and screechiest thing I've ever heard. Graham looked as if he'd lost $1 million. "Come with me," he said in a soft voice, and he ran back to the car, pushing me to his side. He put me in the front seat and explained everything in the car. "I was just trying to scare you. I didn't know there was a person in the house. I have no clue who that was," he said. I knew he was lying. That sick fuck was a child molester. "Why didn't you call the cops?" I asked. He pulled his phone out with the noise level at the top, and he dialed 3 numbers. I could hear the 3 beeps as he pressed the numbers, but I knew he turned off his phone because I heard the clicking sound. Then he started talking into the phone, saying that he was going to report a scream in the forest where we had just been. I knew he wasn't talking to anyone on the phone, because his phone was totally black and turned off. Why am I still in this car with him? I asked myself over and over. After what felt like a day, which was probably only 20 minutes, we arrived at my mom's house. Graham pushed me into the house and told me to go upstairs to my room. I didn't once make eye contact with Graham because I still had no idea what happened. He told me that if I came out, he would take me back to the haunted house. I waited until my mom got home and told her everything. My mom was drunk and thought I was trying to joke around with her because Graham was a good guy that everyone liked and thought was friendly. She got a hold of Graham, and he told her that he took me to a haunted house and tried to scare me. Also, that several hours later before picking me up, he painted part of the walls red so it looked like blood. Then he said, I used a scream on my phone to scare him. So, my mom laughed it off, and I was left in the dust. Several years later, I ponder and ask myself, what would have happened if I would have stayed in that house? And, what was that scream? This event was weird, and I didn't understand why Graham took me there until I was in my early 20s. After my mom and Graham divorced several years later, Graham died of an overdose. Later, we also found out that he was almost charged with raping a girl. Could that have been the person that screamed in the house? A few years ago, I was serving as a missionary for my church, and I had been assigned to go to South Africa. The country is infamous for its high crime rates and corruption at every level of government. However, that didn't deter us, and us missionaries generally went about our activities any way that was necessary, although we did use common sense to keep ourselves safe. My entire first year of South Africa was loads of fun, and besides being served some questionable food, there were only a few isolated instances where I felt like I was in any danger. Mostly I felt pretty safe, but early on in my second year in the country, I was assigned to a small city near the southern coast, and my safety record changed quickly. During my first weekend there were 3 days in a row we found ourselves in danger. The first day, since I had just entered the area, we had to do some shopping for groceries so I could get settled into the flat that I would be staying at. We didn't have a car here. Our main transportation was bicycles, so my new companion and I set out on our bikes. Since we still had most of the day left, we decided to go out and meet some of our people for a while, then stop by the grocery store on the way back to the apartment. At the store, I bought a few bare essentials, like bread, milk, noodles, etc. I hung the few grocery bags I had on the handlebars of my bike, and we went on our way. As we bicycled down the street with my groceries, we noticed 5 or 6 young men, probably between the ages of 17 and 24, loitering near the end of the street. We were bicycling right down the middle of the road, and when these guys noticed us, they strolled out to the center of the road in front of us. We were maybe 40 feet away from them when they walked out, and on our bikes, that distance closed pretty quickly, so we didn't really have time to consider the situation, or we definitely would have turned around. But before I knew it, these men were completely surrounding us, standing very close, none of them more than an arm's reach away. They proceeded to make small talk with us, talking about nothing in particular. But as one of them would draw our attention, I noticed that the ones on the opposite side, where we were looking away from, inconspicuously craned their necks up and over us and looked down into our grocery bags to see their contents. Our interaction continued for about 3 or 4 minutes, after which they obviously decided that my loaf of bread wasn't worth their trouble, and they let us go. That instance itself was closer to danger than I'd ever been in South Africa. But little did I know, it was just the beginning. The very next day, we had a full day of work out in our neighborhoods, and didn't start heading home until after dark. To protect our bikes from theft, we decided to leave them at the home of a family that we knew and trusted very well. This family lived on the outer edge of the neighborhood that we spent most of our time in, so we could leave the bikes there, then enter the neighborhood on foot. Obviously, we had to leave the same way. At the center of the neighborhood is a soccer pitch, surrounded by a 6-foot cinder block wall. We had to walk around the field on the way home. In most of the places I spent my time in South Africa, I was accustomed to being the only white person around, so the possibility of being a target was always at the back of my mind. Non-white South Africans tend to be fairly sociable, so when a young adult male intercepted us and began walking and talking with us, it wasn't extremely unusual. Just unusual enough to make me more alert and attentive, just in case. As the conversation went on, I became more and more suspicious as I paid attention to the information that was being passed between us. Although his tone was completely friendly and sounded harmless at face value, I noticed that the questions he asked were very carefully chosen and probably scripted. Within just a few minutes, he had found out who we were, why we were in the area, and our mode of transportation. But there was one more specific question that, from my stories I have heard, I knew to watch out for, as it was a very good indicator that you might be being targeted. So when he asked, "Do you have the time?" I was in full alert mode. People will ask this question so they can get a good look at your watch, or even better, the phone that you pull out to see what time it is. I had my phone in my pocket, but thankfully I already knew what time it was, as I had just checked it a few minutes before we met this guy. So without pulling out my watch, or phone, or anything, I told him that it was about 9:45 or so. At this point, it was clear that he had all the information he needed. He mumbled a hurried thanks and quickly walked away from us towards a darkened corner store across the quiet street to the right of us. But as I watched him hurry away, I saw him making a curious motion with his hand. He was waving his hand back and forth across his neck, making the universal sign for cut. Straight away I knew what it meant, and my eyes moved up to see who he was signaling to. The image of about half a dozen rough-looking men, barely visible hiding under the canopy of the corner of the store, became burned into my mind forever. It was clear that that man we had been walking with was some kind of a scout who had intercepted us and walked with us to get information to determine whether or not we had anything valuable. And by the time we had walked around the soccer field and past that corner store, the other men were ready to act on the scout's signal. I don't want to know how that night would have played out differently if the scout determined we were carrying anything of significant value, but I'm sure glad he didn't. As soon as we were a good distance away from the hidden gang, we quickened our pace and hurried back to our waiting bicycles. The next day we were back in the same neighborhood again. It was early afternoon with the sun high overhead, but still the streets were pretty quiet, as usual. We had just visited a young family who had questions about our beliefs, and on our way back to the main part of the neighborhood, we walked in front of a large mosque with a bare, open courtyard in the front. The only person in sight was a young man in baggy jeans and a dirty tank top. As we walked near him, he hailed us. This guy wasn't nearly as clever or tactful as our friend from the night before. This time he came straight out with that one question. "Do you have the time?" Both myself and my companion knew what this was about, but this time the phone was in my companion's pocket, so the ball was in his court. And this time, neither of us actually had any idea what the time was. I noticed the man seemed nervous, and his hand was in his pocket. When I looked down at his pocket, I saw an old makeshift handle sticking out, in a way that it was clear that his pocketed hand was clutching it. There aren't too many things that this object could have been. I knew it had to have been a knife. As my companion and I each ran through the scenario in our minds and tried to find a way out, the silence became increasingly tense as he continued to ask us about the time. When we made up an answer, he wasn't satisfied and said that he wanted to see the time for himself. He wanted to see our phones. Eventually, it became very clear that there was no easy way out of this. This guy wasn't going to let us go until he had what he wanted. So my companion removed the phone from his pocket and held it out so the man could see the time on the screen. Thankfully, the phone's Missionary's carrier intended for basic purposes, to keep in touch with the other missionaries and locals via text or phone call. So the phone that we were showing this wannabe thief was an outdated brick, the kind that you can call, text, and play Snake on. But that's about it. Apparently, the man was disappointed. Without saying a word, he turned and walked away, and we stood there and watched him go. As soon as he walked around the corner, I asked my companion if he had seen the knife in the guy's pocket, and he replied, "No, I didn't." And so, for the third time in 3 straight days, we'd escaped almost certain attacks from almost certainly armed thugs, thanks to the simple fact that we didn't carry anything of value. It's most likely that, in each of these situations, the criminals just wanted some easy money, and probably wouldn't have harmed us if we had given them what they wanted. But given the complete ineptitude and corruption of South Africa's police services, there also wouldn't have been much anything preventing them from hurting us if they had a reason to do so. The moral of the story is how important it is to know when you're in an unsafe area and prepare accordingly. Remember that most criminals are only criminals because they're trying to get something from their targets. If they don't see any opportunity in you, they'll probably leave you alone. If you enjoyed this video, you know what to do. If you would like a chance to have your story featured in an upcoming video, check out the description for information on how to submit your stories. I hope you're all having a great weekend, and I'll catch you in the next video. And just remember, it's always scarier if it's true.